Welcome back, listeners. My name is Cade Curtis, your tour guide on this lovely venture I like to call Learning from Friends. It's a pleasure to have you come in and spend your day with us, your afternoon, maybe your evening, whatever you're listening. Because what's important here is that you have chosen to give us your time. So I'm deeply appreciative of that. It's amazing to think we are in season 2. We're somewhere in the range of 30, 40 episodes now that we've done with this. And right now I'm talking to my friend, Matt Marchese. He has come through and lived in my life for the last 17 years. So it's cool to get to sit down and share a little bit more people in my life that I have with you guys. But before we get into what we're going to discuss today with our topics, we know that we have my mom's quote of the day that we're going to do. This one comes from a blogger that is known as Attitudes to Inspiration. So the quote goes, "To be kind is more important than to be right. Many times what people need is not a brilliant mind that speaks, but a special heart that listens." Beautiful quote. So often we are quick to speak, but not quick to listen. So great quote, Mom, to continue on with that one. I'll probably use that one in my classroom in the next couple of days to put up on my whiteboard. So who knows? We'll see where we're at. So jumping back to our today's topic that we're going to discuss is, this is part 2 of an episode that I've done with Matt. Just a little recap of who we are between the two of us. I've known Matt for 17 years. We played in high school. We played in the band together for, 3-4 years on the weekend. So almost every weekend for a while, we hung out and we played music together with one of our own former guests that's on here, Bobby, who was able to write some wonderful music. Last season, his music was the intro and the outro that we had wrote as a band. This season's music came from Ryan Cherry. So again, thank you, Ryan, for giving us our introduction music that we have here. Matt and I went to college at Georgia Highlands. Shout out to Georgia Highlands, Cartersville campus. Great memories. Matt lived at my house. I lived at his house throughout the weeks because we took crazy hours of time together for the year and a half that I was there. But what we're going to do is, last time we were together, we discussed chemical, mechanical, photovoltaic, and thermal energy. Now, today's topic we're going to hit on is the nuclear energy portion, because there is, fission, fusion, and a lot of people have a lot of stigmas that go around it. So to continue on the topic of energy, I want Matt to be able to get us through that, be able to give us a good understanding, because Matt really does a good job of talking with this enthusiasm and understanding on these topics that make you eager to learn and listen, just because he has one of those voices that just catches your attention. Welcome to the podcast, Matt.
Thanks, Cade. Beautiful introduction. And I really enjoyed your opening quote. I think the world does need a kind heart. It goes so much farther than anything that any academia can bring.
That's true. That's one of those things that you just can't teach. You got to be able to have it in you and express it, and it can kind of continue forward. Now, also, I want to say thank you for Zoom to be able to make this happen, because again, you're in North Carolina, I'm in Georgia. So thank you, Zoom, and any of those other things, the video programs that came out of COVID. So woo. So rock and roll. Now, can you give, exactly. Can you give us a quick recap, Matt, from the previous energies that we discussed?
Sure. So we talked about essentially the whole array of different sources of energy. So chemical, mechanical, photovoltaic, and thermal. Chemical being combustion, so coal, natural gas. Mechanical energy being waves, hydropower. Photovoltaic being direct conversion of sunlight to energy. I did skip a mechanical form of energy, which is also wind. And then thermal energy. And this is geothermal, taking naturally existing thermal energy and converting that into electricity. And we also talked about kind of the pros and cons of each category. And we talked about their footprint in terms of mining. We talked about resources and how much footprint the actual plant takes. And we also talked about capacity factor, which we're going to come back to in this episode. And capacity factor is essentially a combination of how long and how much energy is produced versus the theoretical max energy that a certain source can produce. So, for example, for a solar farm, the source reliability, which is the sun, has to do with the capacity factor. How often can it actually maintain that energy output? So obviously it can't produce energy at night. Wind maintenance is a big one. So how long is the power generating device undergoing maintenance or fuel cycles? And so all of these things are very important to consider. And really, I think the net takeaway from last episode was that renewable energies are important to continue to move towards, and they will always be important and an integral part of power production globally. And there are large power sources that produce energy for large grids that are set up to take in single point, very large output power plants. And so for those particular countries and areas, it's important to consider alternatives to some of the renewable resources, but also their impact on the environment and other things, which we will get into in this episode.
Everything's important when it comes to being able to make our energy that we use every day, of powering our computers, being able to drive our cars, being able to do all these different, what we call necessities in life now.
Absolutely.
There's going to be a lot of nitty gritty terminology that's going to come up. So at some point I may pause you to say, hey, can you explain that term? Can you be able to give us a little more detail? Because of a lot of this it's really hard. We don't hear a lot about this, Matt. And I'm glad that you're spending your time to be able to go into this with us. Like it's amazing, because we took us a little while. We recorded the first episode, I believe it was in March, and now we are in the beginnings of October. So scheduling's hard as adults. It's really rough to be able to get it out there. So thank you for giving me your time.
Well, I'd have to say thank you as well. I mean, it is always nuclear energy has a close spot in my heart because, I went to school for it, but it's not just that. I mean, I'm not an actual nuclear engineer right now. I'm mechanical, just because the industry and nuke right now is kind of at a lull. But nonetheless, we'll certainly get into why it is that way and how it can be in the future. And I'm just always excited to talk about anything science related. So
you are, you definitely are, but it's enjoyable to hear it because the way that in my ears, the way that I hear it is it's very enjoyable because I can relate to it. I can be able to connect to it. It makes me feel like, oh man, Matt's bringing it down to my level. Yay. So there's a lot of misconceptions. We're going to go ahead and start here with the misconceptions that are out there with nuclear energy. Do you want to address some of those just basic ones before we dive into some of the further details of some misconceptions?
Sure. So on a high level, I think the term nuclear definitely brings to mind some uneasy thoughts in people's minds. And more often than not, it's the association with nuclear weapons. Now, it's interesting to see that this happened with nuclear energy and not with chemical energy, because as we know, the first bombs were chemical energy bombs, but you don't often think of TNT or high explosives as powering a coal power plant, for example. But nuclear is kind of a different story because it's a different type of energy. It's a different type of physics. I mean, you're talking about subatomic nuclear binding energy. It's a different type of energy. It's much scarier because we didn't really introduce nuclear technology to the world in the form of energy. We introduced it in the form of a weapon, unfortunately. And so I think ever since the 40s, with a caveat of the 40s to 50s ramp up in nuclear energy, I think there was kind of a bad stigma associated with the term nuclear. But it's also important to recognize that there are a lot of different forms of nuclear energy. The most common and observable form is the sun, and that is nuclear fusion. That's what provides energy for almost all the solar systems that we could see in space. In fact, no, all of them. A lot of the energy that we will be relying on in the distant future is also fusion energy. So it's important to make that distinction between nuclear fusion and nuclear fission, which are two different things, but both rely on the physics of atoms and harnessing the energy that binds atoms together, and specifically the nuclei of atoms.
Let's break them into two different sections here. Can you give us some information about fission, and then we'll do fusion afterwards?
Sure. So every atom has a nucleus that's comprised of neutral and positive particles, and neutrons and protons as we know them. And protons like to repel each other, and neutrons certainly don't do anything to stick anything together from an electromagnetic standpoint. And so something has to be gluing these things together. And I'm not going to go into the elementary particles and the physics behind the color force and all of those things, but I will say that there's a binding energy associated with the nuclei of atoms that stores a lot of potential energy. And this energy can be released with large atoms by fissioning the nucleus, by hitting the nucleus with a neutron and causing a resonance, which causes it to split apart and emit a lot of energy in the actual fission fragments. But there's also, with light atoms like hydrogen and different isotopes of hydrogen, a binding energy associated with fusing those together. And the energy released from that reaction means that the final state of those fused subatomic particles has less energy than the initial state. And this is the nuclear stability curve as we know it. And that kind of pivots around iron 56, which is the most stable isotope. And so we see on the periodic table, things heavier than iron tend to give off energy when they're fissioned, and things lighter than iron tend to give off energy when they're fusioned.
Interesting.
Yes, indeed. And fusion is, of course, inherently more stable because to fuse two things together, you need a lot of energy input. And depending on what you're fusing together, you can get a greater energy output than you put in. However, it's not a runaway or self-sustaining reaction. You need to continuously put energy in to get fusion to occur. And so it's very safe. With a fusion reactor, you can essentially flip on a light switch and produce more energy than you're putting in and turn it off and it immediately dies. With fission sources, they cause chain reactions because the neutrons coming off of a fission reaction can initiate a fission reaction in another fissile isotope if they're slowed down sufficiently. And so for this reason, fission tends to be more dangerous because you can't flip it off like a light switch.
Wow. That's pretty crazy to think of the separation between the two and how so much science in our lives that we thought when we were learning it as high schoolers or middle schoolers, when we start building it back together, somebody asks, why is it important for us to learn it? You're like, because we use it every day. This is the life that we look at, and having the neutrons, electrons, protons that are piecing these things together, it literally affects every bit of our life, and specifically with energy. Like we're talking about here, between that fission and that fusion here, because of stability is going to be a long way to be able to make energy work. You want to have stability. You want to feel like you can safely turn on a light switch and your house is not going to blow up on you. Or do you want to be able to know that reliably that if the power goes out, how are we going to replace it? How are we going to be able to bring it back up? What are going to be energy costs? Stuff like that are out there. So why do we want to use nuclear energy? Why is it a power source that is a good option to be able to replace these coal, natural gas? Why do we want to go this direction? We've discussed the other four. Why is nuclear a good option?
So this is a great question. Multifaceted answer, I would say. So first and foremost, we need to consider the environmental impact of the energy sources we're using, especially with not just CO2 emissions, but also the impact on the spatial footprint of these energy sources and just the air quality in general. For a growing population in the Earth, we need to be using more and more efficient sources, but also we need to use reliable sources. And this is where I will come back to capacity factor. The capacity factor for nuclear power, which is a power that has a high enough output to directly couple with the grid the way it's designed right now, is 92.5%, which is higher than any other source of energy right now. Geothermal is just under that at 74.3%. Natural gas is at 56.6%. Hydropower, 41.5%. Coal is at 40%. Wind is at 35.4%. And solar is at 24.9%. And this capacity factor is due to both maintenance and fuel cycles, as well as the reliability of the source of energy in the first place. So renewables are dependent on either the weather or the sun's availability. Geothermal tends to be very steady because the Earth's mantle is constantly producing heat And depending on the environment you're in and how you can tap into that heat, it becomes very stable source of energy.
Is that similar to like geothermal? Or am
That
I
is,
off?
yep.
Okay.
Nope, that's exactly right. Yep. And we have also the chemical sources of fuel, which is probably one of the second most common besides nuclear. And that would be coal and natural gas, which coal plants and natural gas plants have a lot of moving parts. They have combustion taking place, which means there's constantly soot building up. They need maintenance. It needs to be refueled perpetually. These things start to reduce the amount of on time that this power source has. And so that directly affects the capacity factor. The fuel cycle for a nuclear plant is about 1.5 to 2 years, in which every 1.5 to 2 years, about a quarter to a third of the core is replaced. And the other remaining fuel assemblies are shifted outwards towards the outer edge of the core and shuffled in such a way where the power profile across the core, which we'll get to later.
What is a core itself? Like, what is a core?
Great question. So depending on the type of nuclear reactor, oh man, we could go in such a rabbit hole here. The core consists of a bunch of fuel pellets stacked inside a fuel assembly. The fuel assembly itself is comprised of a bunch of fuel pins, which are spring-loaded fuel pellets together. And in between each of the pins flows the moderator and coolant. And because ultimately every large-scale reactor is just trying to heat, boil water, and turn a turbine to produce electricity, whether it's coal heating the water, whether it's radiation heating the water, whether it's sunlight heating the water, like in the example of a solar plant that's not necessarily direct conversion to solar energy from photovoltaic cells, but rather a bunch of mirrors focusing it on a tank of water and boiling the water.
What chemicals are in these rods that they use?
So and I'm going to focus, just to reduce the scope of the conversation, to United States reactors, which are broken down into two types of reactors, but both are light water reactors, meaning just regular water is used to cool and to slow down the neutrons. And the fuel itself is made of an oxide of uranium. So usually it's uranium dioxide, which is a combination of U-235 and U-238 mixed with an oxide matrix. And so it's like a ceramic, basically.
Okay. So if I use I'm going to use imagery here just to see if I can paint a picture for our listeners. If I have about 15 pencils in my hand and I squeeze them all together, if I place that in water, water's going to go in between all the different individual pieces of the pencils. And as it heats up, there's going to be a reaction in the water. And as the water heats up, they're going to transfer that energy back to a turbine, which is going to spin the turbine in order to create the energy that we use. Is that correct?
That's correct. So it goes from nuclear energy, so that the atoms are fissioning, neutrons are flying through the water molecules, bouncing off the hydrogen, slowing down. Also, the alpha particles and fission fragments, they're all depositing heat in the water electromagnetically. Then this water gets hot and it increases in its internal energy. And this mechanical energy is then flowing through the main coolant loop. And this is happening at 3,300 pounds per second. So you've got a small car flowing through this pipe in the form of steam per second. And that mechanical energy is then directed through turbine blades, and it turns a generator, converting that into electricity. And some of the steam is then sent back towards the primary cooling loop and reheated. And so that's a reheat cycle, which we also won't get too much into, but it's essentially a very well plumbed steaming system that keeps the steam dry and hot and maximizes the efficiency of this thermal cycle.
So this core here, my group of pencils that I have here, do I remove, if you said 1.5 to 2 years of replacing the core, are you pulling out one at a time and replacing one, or are you going to pull out and replace the entire core at once?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Yeah, nuclear refueling cycles are very well planned. They're planned months in advance. Every second of downtime costs hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not more. And so it really matters what you're doing every second that core vessel is opened and that you're replacing these fuel assemblies. And so they have software that will map out the burnup of the fuel, which means how it changes in reactivity, both along the length and radially along the core of each fuel assembly, since they will burn up at different rates. and it optimizes the way that new fuel is repopulated into the core, and how old burnt fuel is kind of shuffled out to the outer edges of the core, or shuffled in, depending on the type of core and the geometry and what the fuel source actually is. There are other types of fuel besides just the uranium oxide that we know of. There are mixed oxides and plenty of different types of fuel, which we also probably won't get into in this podcast. But ultimately, a third to a quarter of that core is exchanged every 1.5 to 2 years. Now, because of the enrichment we're running at, and because of the fuel burn up, which is essentially how much of that fissile material did you burn during its fuel cycle, you're actually left with 96% of the fuel left after that 1.5 to 2 years. After it's put in dry storage, you can still burn 96% of that fuel. It still contains a ton of energy.
Wow. That's amazing to think that over the 2.5 years, you only spent like 4% of it, or 6% of it.
Yeah.
That's out there. Unlike whenever we have coal, we burn it and it's gone. And it's only that we have to get truckloads and train loads every single day to be able to do that.
Yeah, that's true. The average coal power plant that has the same power output takes in 4 train loads, each of 40 cars per day. It's burning. So realistically speaking, we're talking about per year, 2.9 billion kilograms of coal versus 1 kilogram of actual reactor fuel.
Wow. And is that per individual piece, like each pencil, or is that for the entire core?
That's for the entire core.
Gotcha. Wow. That's amazing. So you mentioned about replacing, like the maintenance here of being able to work on it to be able to replace these pieces here. When they're doing this, they usually have computer programs and stuff to be able to know which ones to pick, what not to pick out. Is this a manned process where they go in and wearing these suits and remove pieces at a time? Do they shut the core down in the process of doing this? Or is there some form of like machine that goes in and, like the claw machine on a bowling alley where you're going down and you're trying to pick up a stuffed animal and bring it back? How does that work for being able to maintain it?
It's funny you mentioned that. They all have a claw. Some are automated. In fact, Canada has a really cool reactor called the CANDU reactor that uses heavy water, and their refueling process is fully automated. So it's all happening underwater. The reactor core is all automated with robotic arms that replace the fuel assemblies. The light water reactors in the US, specifically boiling water and pressurized water reactors, they actually have to unbolt the top of the pressure vessel, pull it off with a crane. And they do have crane operators manually going in and finding which fuel assembly they need to take out, pulling that out, putting it into a pond so that it can keep cool, because there is decay heat, which happens after you shut down a reactor. And that decay heat drops pretty quickly, but then it exponentially kind of falls and tails off. And it's still producing a lot of heat after a substantial amount of time. So typically, if you have a 3,000 megawatt reactor, 1 second after power down, 3,000 megawatts that reactor core is still producing 165 megawatts. That's a lot of energy and heat.
That is a lot.
So it drops pretty quickly at first, but after an hour, it's at 36. After a day, it's at 15. After a year, it's still at 2.7 megawatts.
Still producing energy. Wow.
It's enough to where after 30 days, it's producing 6 megawatts. If the water evaporates, those fuel pins will still melt.
So do we refurbish these pins, or what happens to it after a pin's been removed? Like, what do you do with this uranium oxide?
What we do with it right now is we put it there's 2 types of storage, but primarily dry cask storage. So first we'll put it in a spent fuel pond and let it bleed off some of that energy for at least a year, typically. So it has a low enough power output to where it can be vitrified. So they take the fuel pellets out that are spent, they put it in essentially a very specialized furnace, and they melt it into a glass. And this glass material is then put into a dry cask, which is rated for, they're very, very strong casks. Let's put it like that. You could put a high explosive on the outside or run into it with a freight train and it would be fine.
Oh, wow.
It's essentially a pill bottle that's very large. And honestly, since the beginning of nuclear power in the United States, we've only produced 64 Olympic-sized swimming pools full of dry cask storage.
Wow.
Which is not much.
Yeah.
when you take into account 64 Olympic sized swimming pools is easily, I mean, a coal plant's going to go through that in a day or two. So
Oh yeah, easily.
there's a lot of misconception in terms of how much waste is actually being produced there.
So does that deal back to you were saying of how fast, like, 6.5, no, 46.5 swimming pools, was it you said? Or full of
64.
64. Yep. So 64, they will go through that basically in a couple of days at a coal plant. So does that mean, how does that affect like the environmental impact in terms of like CO2 and radiation and stuff like that?
Oh, yeah. Great questions. So in terms of CO2, nuclear plants aren't generating, any CO2. Coal plants are scrubbing about 40%. I think that's the standard right now of their CO2, which takes a lot of power off the top of the output. They have to run these scrubbing towers, which use a lot of the energy from the power plant to scrub the CO2 out. But you're still left with a bunch of coke ash. And coke ash pollutes the water that it's near, and it soaks into the water tables. And so you have these big islands of coke ash that you have to do stuff with. And there's really not much you can except for bury it. But in the net, most of the byproducts go into the atmosphere. And that's in the form of large particulates, which can, decrease the quality of the air that you're breathing. And for the more highly regulated power plants, they're scrubbing a lot of that out and as much CO2 as they can. But it's generating at least 40% of the global CO2 production. The other 60% is mostly vehicles and cars. It's a substantial amount. And to be honest, electric vehicles, I mean, a lot of people talk about the grid not being able to support that kind of electrical output. When we start shifting towards nuclear and we start shifting towards electrical cars, we're not going to have the need for as many coal and specifically natural gas and petroleum refineries. These refineries are not talked about very much for obvious reasons, to me anyway. There's a lot of reasons those larger oil and petroleum companies don't want people to know that these plants that are refining the petroleum have dedicated power plants, gigawatts, just to run them. It takes a ton of energy to convert these fuel sources to usable fuel sources that we're then burning in cars. So it's a very inefficient process. It's not talked about very much because the fuel is so cheap. Exactly. There's also a lot of moving parts with all this. There's a lot of maintenance. There's a lot of inefficiencies. There's a lot of subsidies. And not to say that there's not subsidies for nuclear as well. I mean, there's a plethora of subsidies, but we'll get into that too.
Everything had its own point of what's, going to happen, what's useful, what's not going to be useful. And we're going to see tons of stuff that happens behind the scenes that we'll never know about until 20, 30, 50 years later after they start exploring this, or secrets start getting leaked out because there was a nuclear explosion, which we'll talk about Chernobyl here in a little while. Because that's a massive one that we'll get there. But the environmental impact, terrible to think about. The 40% comes from our coal plants. That is just producing it. 60% of it comes from, the usage of it within our cars and other sources that are being put out there. But CO2, that's, that's why cities that have it have smog, have lots of other issues, like health issues that are going to pop up with your lungs. And we see like in China that they wear we see that we worry with COVID. Oh my gosh, we have to wear this mask in order to stop like spreading the disease or virus. They're having to wear that kind of stuff almost a couple of days a week because of how high the carbon counts in the air and the air pollution that's been created because of some of their factories in the area. So that's a huge environmental impact just from coal right there.
Yep. And sulfur dioxide.
With the nuclear power plants, what about radiation?
Yeah, I was just going to say another common misconception about nuclear plants is that they generate radiation and that living near a plant is not healthy. But the fact of the matter is that the NRC regulates the shielding in reactors to such an extent that you actually receive 3 times the radiation dose living within 50 miles of a coal plant than you do from living in any distance from a nuclear power plant.
What does it mean by the shield?
So the shield is, there's a nuclear plant is comprised of multiple layers of protection. So there's the innermost layer, which is the actual containment vessel, the primary pressure vessel. And this is a massive, thick, I mean, we're talking 4 feet thick pressure vessel of steel. And it also has a whole nother layer of a few feet thick steel shroud around the actual core, which is reflecting neutrons back into it. This primary pressure vessel is shielding a lot of the radiation coming off the core. The rest of it's being absorbed into the water and into the actual pressure vessel itself. Then that whole primary system in a PWR, for example, there's 3 loops of coolant. The first is just circulating as liquid water. The second is being turned into steam. And the third is cooling that steam off and condensing it again, coming from a natural source. So that inner pressure vessel is surrounded by a massive containment area or containment dome, which is reinforced concrete with a ton of rebar. And underneath the pressure vessel is a huge concrete slab that's very thick. It ranges depending on what type of reactor it is and what generation reactor it is. And that concrete slab is there in case the fuel does melt down, like Fukushima. It melts through the pressure vessel, it hits the concrete, mixes with the concrete, melts the concrete, a lot of it, but then it eventually solidifies before it hits any soil or the water table. It's completely contained. And we'll talk about why a nuclear meltdown is not as scary as it sounds. It's only scary when the outer containment is breached and those gases are allowed to hit the atmosphere. And we'll talk about why that happened at Fukushima and why that happened at Chernobyl. But ultimately, there are multiple layers of concrete containment and also steel containment for the radioactive emissions, which most of which are stopped after the first barrier, but especially after the second. So even being in operations or in the plant itself, you're not exposed to radiation that's higher than background levels.
Here you're mentioning, all these different layers, all this different cement and all this stuff in order to help cool off. What is the footprint of one of these places, like a nuclear power plant? Because we know there's, whenever you're doing a mining operation and all the process to refine something, to be able to get it to the plant, then getting it from the plant to placing it, all the wires and cables out that runs to our homes. What does this operational footprint look like for nuclear power?
So typically nuclear plants are about 1 to 1.3 square miles. And that's only because of how much fence and essentially guarded area of land there is around the plant itself. The plant itself, I mean, a lot of small plants just take up maybe 10 acres. So it's a lot of...
Wow, only 10 acres. That's wow.
Yeah. In fact, there are small modular reactors that are being designed right now that would take up the footprint of a few acres maybe. Now, that does go to kind of segue into the proliferation and safety aspects of a nuclear plant, since we're on this topic.
Oh yeah, it's important to be able to know, setting something up, if it may be hundreds of acres in process, to setting something down that's 10 acres. That seems a lot more compact and controlled, but how do you make that work? Where's all this? You don't have the trains coming in. You don't have all this other things, because we're used to seeing all the trains bringing in this material. We're used to seeing all the smokestacks going up. We're used to seeing all these pipelines that are going in the different directions. I'm curious about, the safety and all this. What does it look like? Because I know we have, I think we have 300 and something around the world of these nuclear power plants. I just have not gone to one in the United States. I know we have a couple here in the United States.
Yeah, it's a scary ordeal. We went in college and
okay.
We got to the front gates, and this is like a mile probably from the plant, half mile from the plant. And there's a bunch of guards there with machine guns, and there's all kinds of concrete barriers and huge steel ramps that come out of the ground. So you not even a tank can drive through it. Surrounded by, of course, a bunch of woods and sensors all over those woods. And so you get to the gate, you show 10,000 forms of ID, you're with someone that can vouch for you, that's with the NRC. It's all just very much approval process. Then you start on the road towards the plant, and you pull up to the plant, and there's 2 layers of barbed wire fence that is probably 20 or 30 feet tall, electric fence. And there's guard posts on the corners of all the fence junctions. These guard posts are populated with a couple snipers each 24/7. We were thinking, wow, okay, so we hadn't even begun yet though. get out of the car, get to the front doors, and go through security. And we, of course, had to take everything off, helmets, shoes, go through a bomb sniffing gate, a few dogs, a metal detector, depending on the level of security you're with. You have a badge at all times on you. And anytime you go through a door, all the doors at the plant are double doors. And so if you have a tour guide, everyone loads into the double door area, and the back door has to shut before the front door, the next door is allowed to open, and everyone has to be present and accounted for with their ID cards. And that tour guide has to be with them at all points in time. And so it's very, very, very tight security, especially as you approach the control room and those kind of areas. That's just to get into the general area, all that.
Wow, that sounds tighter than Fort Knox.
Yeah, it felt like it. I've never been to Fort Knox, but it sure felt like it. Now, this is now from an actual security standpoint. When it comes to terrorism, there are these containment domes that are built around the reactor vessels, are designed to take a fully loaded, fully fueled 747 at maximum speed as a direct impact, and it would barely chip the concrete. So they're designed for taking terrorist attacks. Now, this is an interesting point because a lot of people think, okay, well, a terrorist is going to try to blow up a power plant. Well, it's not the most effective way for a terrorist to actually terrorize using nuclear technology. The real concern is proliferation of nuclear waste. So with
what is that word?
Proliferation, great question. Proliferation means that it is the illegal leaking of nuclear materials into a terrorist's possession. And this happened a lot at the end of the USSR when they were selling off warheads and enriched material. But nowadays, there's such a tight regulation on enriched material that most of the proliferation scares and potentials come from people getting their hands on spent nuclear fuel and putting a bunch of high explosive next to it and just blasting it everywhere as a dirty bomb, they call it, because it's not a nuclear explosion. It's just a high explosive explosion that's spraying radioactive material everywhere. Fresh nuclear fuel is very much not radioactive, believe it or not. You can actually take a fresh fuel pellet and put it in your hand and you're fine. I mean, you don't want to keep it there for too long unless you're wearing rubber gloves. But fresh nuclear fuel doesn't have much background radiation to it. Spent nuclear fuel has a ton of long-lived isotopes that you do not want to spray into the environment. And so it's not as much of a risk of blowing up a nuclear plant, although that could be catastrophic in certain ways, especially because of the xenon gas and other radioactive gases. It would take a bunker buster to do that. And most first world countries, as we've just seen in Ukraine, most first world countries are not interested in destroying a nuclear plant. They would rather take possession of it and gain the benefits of having an operational nuclear plant, because that's far more valuable than destroying a plant and contaminating land that you're trying to take over.
Yeah, exactly. Once you contaminate that, there's a long afterlife that comes with that,
right?
That you cannot take back.
And furthermore, if Russia was to try to bomb our nuclear plants, they wouldn't waste their time with a bunker buster. They would just drop a nuke on us. So it's not the risk is really not in any high technology exploding a nuclear plant. The nuclear plants are designed to be extremely safe against any kind of terrorist attack, which is the heaviest plane you can think of with the most fuel you can think of hitting it face on. That's the biggest risk in terms of terrorism, and of course proliferation. So proliferation has a huge impact on how much enrichment and what kind of fuel commercial nuclear plants are allowed to burn, which is no more than 5% enrichment. To get weapons grade, you need to be at least more than 90. So it would take a lot to enrich if they were to get their hands on fresh fuel. So really it comes down to how we handle and store spent fuel. And it is very, very, there's a reason that the spent fuel is kept mostly on the site of the nuclear plant, because nuclear plants have some of the best security around.
Yeah, that's amazing to think about that. What you described going through, it's like trying to escape Alcatraz multiplied by like million.
Yeah, not to mention all the stuff they didn't show us. I'm sure there's plenty of that all through the woods around the plants. I mean, you don't want to get anywhere near them.
Well, that comes a lot of maintenance to be able to keep up with that in comparison to a lot of our coal plants and stuff. They're not as highly protected in the same way
Yeah.
of a nuclear power plant would be. So I guess that's something to factor, but
Yep.
nothing, I'm sure nothing in comparison of what it does
Very
in the
high
long run.
upfront costs and reasonably low operational costs, although they are not by any means small. We're talking about 7 cents per kilowatt hour when it's up and running. Coal is cheaper. It's 5 cents per kilowatt hour. There's a lot more maintenance. There's a lot more moving parts in a coal plant. You got pulverizers. You're flinging coal dust everywhere. You've got this big fire hurricane you're trying to maintain in the combustion chamber. You got coolant pumps, of course. Nuclear reactors, the only moving part really is the coolant pumps and their control rods. That's pretty much everything else is static. It's just a static piece of metal or pipe. And all that's moving is the turbine blades, the control rods. So there's a lot less maintenance because these reactors are designed to operate for 40 years. That's the contract they sign. 40 years because radiation does begin to harden and make some of the pressure vessel and steel materials brittle over time after they get bombarded with neutrons.
So how do you turn down a plant after 40 years?
Yeah.
Like, is that like, okay, we're turning the plant off, it's gone, it's done? Or is it, okay, we're going to renew the contract for another 40 years? Like, explain that a little bit, please.
That's a good point. Decommissioning a reactor is non-trivial. You've got to be very careful about the way you dispose of the materials. Oftentimes, the way they decommission a reactor, especially one that has issues, they'll take it apart piece by piece from the inside out, making sure that they put the higher radioactive materials in containment vessels until they cool off, so to speak. If it's an emergency situation like Chernobyl or other situations, they'll just dump a bunch of concrete onto it and come back 10 or 20 years later to try to fix it. This was back before. So let's go into that. Let's go into loss of coolant accidents and nuclear meltdowns, because there are.
So we're going to go to Chernobyl and Fukushima and a couple of those.
It's probably a good segue.
That's probably a good spot to kind of hit into. But before we do that, I actually had a question. You were talking about building it, the infrastructure and everything. What would it cost? Someone's wanting to invest and make this plant. How long would it take to build it? And what would it cost?
So great question. Typically it costs about $6 to $9 billion to get a nuclear plant up and running. Installing
it, putting everything in place, getting people hired, and let's go.
Yep. And then you've got to have the plant operators trained, and they've got to, first learn how to operate the plant effectively with the simulators. And I'm not sure that the actual overnight costs is what they call it, the cost for construction. I don't know if it includes training the operators, but nonetheless, 6 to 9 billion is non-trivial.
How long would that take to be able to build it? Like, okay, I've got $6 billion and I go, here you go, Matt, build this plant. How long is that going to take me to get my plant?
According to the contractors, right? We can use Georgia's, because they were the last to build nuclear reactors in the United States. We could look at Plant Vogtle, for example. When I was first starting school at Tech, so this must have been 2014.
Probably 13, because
2013.
12, 13, somewhere in that range. After I graduated University of Georgia, you were starting up at Tech.
Okay, so as freshmen, 2013, we were as second freshmen, because of course, I did the whole.
You did it twice. Yeah, exactly.
As second freshmen, we were entered a new course. We were taken for a tour of Plant Vogtle, and this is a brand new plant. They just started construction on it in 2013. They were like, it's going to take us like 3 years, maybe 4. So they were already trying to recruit us as plant operators. And this was Southern Nuclear, which is Southern Company. They own pretty much all power generation on the East Coast. It's kind of a monopoly, that industry. They like to change their names, but it's all the same.
Fair play. With most monopolies, it works that way.
Right. Yeah. So same with telecom and all that. But it was not even a couple months ago, maybe, that they started to wrap things up. So they went
9 years,
at least 3 times. Yeah. So it takes a long time. It takes way longer than you anticipate. And you've got to really pick your building site strategically. They spent at least 1.5 to 2 years just compacting the soil before they put any concrete down for the base.
How large of an area does that serve? Does that plant serve? Is it like 50 miles, 200 miles? Once it's constructed, completed, and fully operational.
So that's total of 4 cores, AP1000s. So that'll be 4 gigawatts of energy. Hopefully in the next year, it'll be operational. Cores 2 or 3 and 4 is what they were building. They already had 2 there, and it'll be supplying power to most of the Southeast.
Wow.
So South Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, some even to Florida, maybe some to North Carolina. It's going to have a ton of power.
So when they're making a plant like this, it is not just that, oh yeah, this is like most coal plants are only doing a couple of cities. This is something that's like, this will do states.
Yes.
That's cool.
And the footprint really isn't that much bigger than a square mile or 2. It's pretty small when you take into account just the plant area, which is very small, and the surrounding area, which is mostly for security. And it's in the middle of nowhere in Georgia off the Savannah River. It's up near Augusta, actually.
How do we transfer that energy? Like, okay, now we've got it. We stored it. It's in this. Is this something that we're going to like send underground into houses? Or they're using power lines? Because you're saying power lines are super inefficient. How's that energy going to get to my home?
They are, unfortunately. The usage of power is also inefficient, but we have been researching a couple things. So at Georgia Tech, they've got research going on for a superconducting grid. That's the ultimate solution to at least I²C losses, which is heat and ohmic losses from resistance in the power lines. Then there's load following and actually adapting to reactive loads on the grid, which come from mostly the commercial sector. Any kind of motors, anything that's an inductive load typically will cause chaos to occur on the grid because of reflections. And probably won't go into that too much right now, but ultimately we need a reactive grid that can actually adapt to what its load is locally. And we need superconducting wires, ideally underground, because these things have to be in pipes with liquid helium or liquid hydrogen. They need to be super cool. Most superconductors need to be very, very cold to be superconducting. There are some room temperature superconductors. Room temperature, they say, it's actually still very cold, but it uses very exotic materials.
Gotcha.
But nonetheless, if you have liquid hydrogen or helium, you can have some more common materials that are superconducting at those temperatures.
So it's still a work in progress of making it work and for the future. But that's go back to like Chernobyl. That's work our way back that way with the big nuclear accidents with Fukushima and Chernobyl.
Let's start with Chernobyl. Let's go in like chronological order. We probably won't hit any of the military accidents because those aren't even really documented.
There's been
at least for the public
hundreds of nuclear accidents that we don't hear about, but we hear about
most of what
we hear about Fukushima and we hear about Chernobyl because those were massive and they were not in the United States.
Yeah. Although Russia did everything they could for us not to find out.
And we had the one in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Yeah.
3 Mile Island. Yeah. So we'll get to there too. 3 Mile Island, though, was actually not a catastrophe. They avoided meltdown, fortunately, by the skin of their teeth. But yeah, that would have been bad if that kept going. But so Chernobyl was very, very early stages of nuclear power plant. It was a primitive design. It had literally a big graphite block moderating the neutrons. It used highly enriched plutonium fuel. And ultimately, so let's talk about a concept called void coefficient.
Void, like VOID?
A void coefficient.
Okay, cool.
Yep. So reactor's void coefficient has to do with what happens to the reactivity of the nuclear reactions when the moderator is gone, no longer present. So in the case of a graphite moderated reactor, the moderator is the graphite, which is in itself flammable. And the reactor, the way it was designed, had a positive void coefficient, meaning that if that reactor was to catch fire or go supercritical and that moderator was to be lost, the reactivity would go up. So it would become more critical, more supercritical if it was supercritical. This is not a situation you want to happen.
Yeah.
It's not.
You don't want any nuclear reaction being going bad.
Right. And especially not one that gets worse and worse as it goes bad. So essentially what happened though in Chernobyl was this was kind of a night before a parade during the USSR. They were parading their nuclear missiles, and they had some of the scientists that were running an experiment at the reactor for how much energy they could extract during a power down transient. So how could they still produce energy as they were powering the reactor down? They took them off their shift to be a part of this parade, and the shift that replaced them wasn't properly trained. They had a transient that they didn't know how to deal with quick enough, and it caused the graphite pile to catch on fire, and the reactivity went up and ultimately burnt through the containment area, which was basically just a warehouse. There wasn't really any containment on that reactor. And it was a stack of just poor planning. I mean, even how volatile that reactor was, it was poor planning that caused the accident. And so this is perfect segue into 3 Mile Island.
Do it.
3 Mile Island was also due to poor planning. There were some safety relief valves that were known to be not working properly. They had maintenance working on the coolant loops, and one of the valves was stuck open, one of the relief valves for the system. So when it was turned back on, they saw loss of pressure. They started to lose a ton of coolant. They finally isolated it down to this valve. Well, what happens is with pressurized water reactors, they have a negative void coefficient, which means that if the water boils off or heats up, the density decreases. So as the water heats up, the density of the water decreases, and it doesn't moderate neutrons as efficiently.
Okay.
There's less hydrogen atoms per unit volume. The neutrons scatter less, which means they slow down less, which means they're too fast to cause fission in the neighboring fuel pins. So they're just bouncing off the fuel, but not causing fission as much. So, and as it boils off completely, then there's just air between the fuel pins. Now, this is for direct fission. This also depends on how much spent fuel and radioactive waste there is in the pin, because the radioactive waste itself will produce heat, which is independent of the heat being produced by direct fission. But the point is, though, it's much more controllable with a negative void coefficient, because as your coolant and your moderator boils off or gets hot, the reactivity goes back down. As the reactivity goes down, the core temperature goes down, the water then condenses again. And this is kind of how a boiling water reactor works too. It's easier to control in the sense that as the water boils, which is directly happening in the core, versus a pressurized water reactor where the water in the core is always liquid. It never is allowed to boil. So it's more thermally efficient, but it's got more cooling loops and more parts, and it's more expensive. But with a boiling water reactor, same concept. It heats up, boils the water, the reactivity goes down, the core temperature goes down, the water condenses, becomes liquid again, moderates neutrons more efficiently, then the reactivity goes back up, and it kind of cycles. And so it gives you more response time is what that does. 3 Mile Island accident was also very preventable. We knew what was wrong. It's kind of like the NASA situation. You don't know until you really push the limits, or you don't, I guess you learn the hard way in that sense.
That's a good way of describing it.
Yeah. So that's what happened with 3 Mile Island. Now, Fukushima, let's talk about that, because during a core meltdown, the risk is not of an nuclear explosion. The risk is not even in the melting fuel hitting the water table, because they've already covered those bases. There's concrete slabs that'll catch the melting fuel. It won't melt past the concrete based on, the design of the fuel itself and the chemistry of the fuel and how long it stays hot when it's all melted into what they call corium, which is essentially just a melting mass of everything: the fuel pins, the cladding, the pressure vessel, the concrete. It's all melted into this big puddle of nastiness that's hot for a long time. That's all manageable. Nothing gets released into the atmosphere. Where the problem is, or where the problem begins, is hydrogen that's being produced constantly from the reaction of boiling water and the cladding, the zircaloy cladding on the fuel pins. And they use zirconium-based alloy because it's transparent to neutrons. So it makes a really good pin material to hold your pellets in. It's kind of like a window for neutrons. The downside is that when water evaporates off of a very hot zircaloy surface, it produces H2. And that hydrogen gas then accumulates in the pressure vessel. And with Gen 2 reactors, which are a lot of the older designs from the 60s, like they were designed in the 50s and 60s and put into place in the 70s. So they're super old. And that's what's actually still running today. That's what Fukushima Daiichi was. They didn't have a good way of managing the hydrogen. And so, especially during a meltdown situation, you have tons of hydrogen gas being produced. And once that gas reaches a critical temperature, or if there's enough oxygen inside the primary containment area, it will explode. And with a hydrogen explosion, you are now exploding all of that shielding from the inside out. And so all the concrete dome and everything that was made to take on external load is now taking on internal load, and it's shattering. And now you've got all this radioactive gas getting released to the environment. So the real risk was not in the melted fuel pins or the melted core. It was in the hydrogen that then broke apart, that exploded and broke apart the containment. Containment is critical. Well, two things are critical when it comes to meltdowns. You have to keep water flowing on the core. If you lose power and you lose pumps, you've still got to get water onto the core. And so what happened at Fukushima, it was a perfect storm. There was a flood. It knocked out their primary generators, their secondary generators. Well, of course, there's a whole 2 generations of reactors that have been designed since that have not been built or installed yet because of the lack of funding now. That passive, it's all about passive decay heat removal, passive safety. So you don't need pumps to keep water on the core. That's the way all modern reactors are designed. Mm-hmm. So even if you lose all power, you're still safe. And they have much better ways of managing hydrogen production. So even if you lose water, you're not at risk of exploding, and you still have everything in the containment. So modern reactors are very safe, inherently safe, and passively safe. And the reason Fukushima happened was because it was 70s technology. They did not have a good way of maintaining or managing their hydrogen gas. They tried, and they did a really good job, honestly. They were venting hydrogen periodically. They kept pumping inert gas into the containment area. So they were doing everything they should have. And they worked for one of their reactors. But one of them, there was eventually a hydrogen explosion. And so that's where the real risk comes in, is nuclear technology takes so long to prove out and to get to the point where you're okay putting it in a commercial setting, that we may have had designs since the 90s that already mitigated all these issues, but it takes 10 or 20 years just to validate them before you're allowed to build them. And then even then, it's such a big upfront cost. After something like Fukushima happens, the public is so afraid of nuclear power that it's never going to have the funding that it needs to get to where it needs to go.
So really a plant that you're wanting to put together, that you have this $6 billion for, is taken so long to get the approval at this point. It was designed maybe 10 years ago before it even can get vented. So you may have a whole entire new plan or new idea when this one's being built that was designed 10 years ago. Does that make sense?
Yeah. 20.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. 20 years is the rule of thumb. So reactors that are being built now started their design anyway 20 years ago. So that's like the plants we just built in Augusta, Georgia.
Wow.
Old technology, 1990s. So that's almost 30 years, right?
Yeah.
Wow.
Time does fly, and it keeps on moving. Say all of a sudden people have to evacuate an area. They're gone from it. They're no longer there. People are existent in other parts of the world, but they're not existent in that area where the plant is. How long till that plant is completely going to the reactor's going to explode, or if it's not dismantled correctly, what's going to happen? How long do you have of safety?
Well, So let's put it like this. The reactor, after the hydrogen explosion, or if that's mitigated, there's no other explosion that needs to be worried about. But the radioactive contamination is not going to change over any meaningful time scale until humans intervene and shield it. It's a sad fact that it is what the cost of nuclear fission disasters is that you have to get trucks and robots in there and people, if you can do it safely, to cover things up and to collect the radioactive contamination and to isolate it. Now, a lot of the isotopes that will find their way out, like the gaseous isotopes, like xenon, are shorter lived. So in months, they're
so
pretty
this
much
will
gone.
just continue to spread and continue to spread, if not contained.
Yeah, the gaseous parts will. Yep, it'll continue to spread for. I mean, the long-lived isotopes will last thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, even some of them.
Gotcha.
In a close proximity to the site.
If not contained,
like the gaseous ones.
If not contained, it's going to take out like a whole entire section of, say, the United States, or a whole entire section of the world. That will be completely done. So end of the world.
So it's not an option, basically. Yeah. Chernobyl, either way, people had to get in there and clean it up.
Yeah.
And that's why Fukushima has costed taxpayers to date about $187 billion of cleanup.
So really what will be the end of the world will come down to not being able to take care of those plants, which will end us all.
So taken care of properly, we'll all be healthier than we've ever been. In the case of a disaster, there have to be mitigation plans in place for disasters and cleanup. And that cleanup is proportional to what generation reactor it was. Gotcha. So the likelihood of a disaster, I mean, it takes a lot. It took a flood on unprecedented scales to cause a disaster on a reactor that was designed and built in the 60s, really, in the early 70s. So for modern reactors to fail, it would take more than that, a lot more.
And that's going to be interesting to see as our weather starts to change over time. And really, I guess that also comes down, you got to choose where you're putting this at to make sure that you're understanding what could theoretically happen there. It's like earthquakes and tsunamis and all this different stuff that's out there. You want to be, okay, where's the most safest of location that I could put this to be there kind of in place?
And it's a balancing act of, when I say a balancing act of renewables, we really have to consider the reality of things. Is nuclear fission the best option for humankind right now? Maybe. It just takes considering the fact that your capacity factor is very low for most natural resources. Yeah. You can't depend on enough power to be produced consistently.
That's true.
Without having a massive amount of acreage and capital investment in wind farms and solar farms, which take a lot of maintenance. Not only that, if they get hit with a natural disaster like a hurricane or a flood, and you knock out a whole solar farm and a bunch of turbines, you're starting from scratch. That's a lot of surface area to protect against natural disasters versus a small containment dome. So fission is risky, and it's not the safest option for people in terms of potential disasters, but it's also by far the only viable option for the amount of power we need to produce safely. And I shouldn't say it's not the safest option. It is actually one of the safest power sources that exists right now in terms of fatalities.
Interesting.
But that's also because we've been responsible with it. It's not to say that a country can't become irresponsible with it. In fact, I will say that nuclear fission power is not made for all countries. If you're a country that has the resources to responsibly employ nuclear fission power, then you should pursue it. But if you're not, it's dangerous. I don't think countries that are volatile right now should be thinking about nuclear power as an option.
Gotcha. That's smart. I didn't, my brain thought there, but it never actually made it within our conversation, because if somebody goes, oh, if I can sink the money into, say, this third world country, be able to maintain it and be able to export the stuff out, if you don't have the infrastructure there in place in the first place, it's not going to work.
Yeah.
So that's true. That makes
proliferation
a ton of sense.
Is the biggest threat. It's not the meltdown. It's It's proliferation, because it's just a matter of time. And the fact is, whether or not we have nuclear power plants, it's a matter of time until proliferation occurs and an improvised nuclear device is detonated somewhere in the world. It's going to happen.
So nuclear power is what you would say is probably the better option for the future.
For the immediate future, yes, until we come up with a lot of different ways to mitigate the capacity factor of the renewables and the maintenance costs. Now, nuclear fusion is a nice thought. It's nice to think about, but it's probably further behind, like it always seems to be, than 2050. A lot of people say we won't have fusion plants till 2050. But what we need to do is find a better way to harvest tritium to make that a reality. And the best way to do that right now is to mine it from the moon. So believe it or not, the space exploration programs are not a waste of money for, in my opinion, a lot of reasons, but there's one of them.
Yeah, I know that they're talking about mining as well on asteroids. Certain asteroids as well are having that capabilities as well, besides the moon.
Yep, there's private companies looking at mining precious metals from asteroids. Space is a whole new frontier, I'm sure, for capitalism, which I'm sure a lot of countries have different opinions of that, which makes sense.
That is extremely scary to think about that.
Yeah, we've just got to make sure that whatever we do, our generation, future generations, we just need to have a big heart. We need to be kind to one another and be thoughtful about what we're doing to the environment, how we're working together instead of competing with one another. Even though competition is, of course, healthy in certain ways, it
could be dangerous in many
not
others.
in others.
Yeah.
So a lot of times it's just you're trying to feel safer than the other person, and at some point, as a species, we'll evolve past that. But
I sure hope so, that we can be able to find some peace on earth and goodwill towards man. I feel like I'm doing a Christmas story now, but
oh, absolutely.
But I appreciate these 2 episodes on amazing bits of knowledge about energy, because we see it, we deal with it on a daily basis, but we have no clue how it works. It's just that magic. It's pure magic to us because of it's something that's just, as I said, readily available. We don't think about it because it's there. So I hope in the next, our generation will be, 30 years from now, in the 50s, when we should have the theoretical plants you're talking about, will be in our 60s. So who knows where we'll be from now? Maybe in 2060, we'll be able to look back, or 2050, we'll be able to look back. Oh yeah, this podcast existed and was Matt correct? Was Matt wrong? Who knows? And
that's true. Who knows?
And I just, again, I can't say thank you enough for spending your afternoon and evening with me on discussing this. Is there any last minute things that you
likewise
want to add to, just in general, that maybe we didn't discuss, or something that you would like to be able to leave, like a word of advice to somebody or a group of people? The floor is yours, Matt.
I have 2 pieces of advice that pretty much distill everything I've learned in life so far. Keep an open mind and keep an open heart.
I love that. As we all start to wind down here, my friends, my listeners, my companions, all those people out there in the world, my students, if you are listening, make sure you get your homework and stuff turned in, study for your test. You know the bit. It's all out there. If you want to reach out to me, I will relay messages over to Matt. If you would like to be able to learn some more information, as we exchange a couple of emails, if Matt approves, I'll give you his email. You can be able to reach out to him when he approves on that, just for safety and confidential reasons here. Also, if you want to reach out to me through that, you need to be able to do CADE, which is CADE, at Learning from Friends, entirely like the podcast name, .com. So it's CADE at learningfromfriends.com. You can find me on Facebook. I'm on Twitter. If you'd like to make a donation to the podcast, I have a Patreon page. It's also Learning from Friends podcast. You can be able to find it on there. I would love to, even if it's $1.25, It all adds up over time. But with that, as we all leave out, you all know that I have my traditional sign off of my name is Kay Curtis, your tour guide on this lovely venture I like to call Learning from Friends. And most of all, don't forget to let your curiosity fly high.